gentlemen, it is my pleasure today to introduce the director of the Kansas division of the American Civil Liberties Union, Micah Kubic. Now, for those of you who do not know the ACLU, it is an organization that oftentimes finds itself defending unpopular causes. And I would imagine that there's probably no one in this room that does know the ACLU that probably has not been offended by one of the positions that they've taken, me included. They're a great organization, however, and if you ever get caught in the crosshairs of a constitutional issue where your rights are being infringed upon, you will be delighted to have them on your side. Our speaker is a native, was born in San Francisco, but spent most of his life in Kansas City. He is a graduate of North Kansas City High School, a bachelor's degree from George Washington University, plus he has a master's and a PH.D. in African American politics from Howard University. That is an incredible, interesting educational background, as Howard University is essentially an African American university. He was one of the only white guys there. I would also point out that he has written many pamphlets and publications. He's also published a book called Freedom, Inc., and Black Political Empowerment. And again, he currently serves as Executive Director of the ACLU of Kansas. So I'm going to turn the program over to him and let him tell us what's going on in Kansas and maybe around the country, if he can. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. All right, so we'll start again because when I extend the greeting, your job is to return it. So we'll try again. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Much better, thank you. So I'm very happy to be here with you today. My name is Micah Kubic. I'm the Executive Director of the ACLU of Kansas. And I want to thank Bill very much for suggesting and having me here today. It's been my great pleasure to get to know Bill a little bit over the last couple of years. He is a very dedicated guy, very insightful, and he gave me some really good financial advice. So I'm especially grateful for that reason. I thought I would start today by just reading to you a little bit from my mailbag, some comments, some letters that have come to me over the last couple of weeks. So first, I got a letter from a teacher named Micah, who immigrated here from Germany in the late 1980s. And she wrote to me to say that you have a difficult but desperately necessary road ahead of you. So many of us are depending on you, your colleagues, and the ACLU right now. Be strong and be safe because we are counting on you. I also received a note from a doctor named Trent in Salina, who wrote to me to say, "It is so clear to me that Dr. King's dream of equality and justice, a voice and a vote for everyone, is under attack, and there are even some who want to kill that dream off. We are counting on you at the ACLU to keep the dream alive." And then finally, I received a Facebook message from a woman named Jenny, who lives in Johnson County, who wrote to me to say, "Last night I came home to find my 19-year-old daughter sitting cross-legged on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. My daughter is gay. When she was able to get words out at all, she told me that she was considering suicide, because she is so afraid of what will happen to her and her partner, because she's afraid that there are some who want to take away her rights or target her for violence. I told her that there are plenty of people out there who will fight hard to make sure that she doesn't have anything bad happen to her. Our family is counting on you at the ACLU to protect our daughter and everyone else." Now, I picked those three letters for one reason. I get lots of mail. A lot of it is not nearly so kind and generous. I get lots of mail, but I picked those three letters in particular because they all used that same phrase, counting on you. Counting on you. And it made me wonder why it is there are folks who are counting on the ACLU. And I think the reason for that is that because for us at the ACLU, everyone counts. Everyone counts. That's what we were founded on more than 97 years ago, and that is the principle that we defend today. that everyone in this country counts, no matter who they are or where they come from or what they look like. Everyone counts. We were founded 97 years ago for one reason and one reason only, and that is to defend the Constitution, to defend the Bill of Rights, to defend the rights and freedoms that belong to every person in this country, whether that be the right to be yourself, the right to express yourself, the right to have equal protection under the law, the right to due process, the right to vote. Regardless of the right that we defend, the fundamental principle is the same, that everyone counts. And we fight for that principle in three main ways. We do it through litigation, so we sue people a lot, all day, every day. On any given day of the year, we have more than 3,000 lawsuits running in this country to defend people's constitutional rights. We have 300 full-time litigators around the country who do nothing but litigate on constitutional and human rights. And that makes us not only the country, but the world's largest human rights law firm. We don't just sue people, though. We also do advocacy work. So we work in Congress and state legislatures and city councils and county commissions and school boards, not only to stop them from doing things that we think are ill-advised, but also to make sure that our rights and freedoms are strengthened and deepened in the meantime. And then finally, we do work in communities. We do community organizing and public outreach and education, because we think that the best way to defend freedom in this country is not for folks to always have to depend on an organization like the ACLU, but rather to know their own rights, to be able to stand up for themselves in the moment and be defenders of their own freedom. So those are the three ways that we work to defend the principle that everyone counts. And make no mistake about it, although it has always been an imperfect principle, because there have always been points in our history when some group of people did not, in fact, count in our system of government. The truth is that for most of our history, we have been making great progress on that front. More and more we have said that everyone counts. And yet today, I would suggest to you that in many respects, that principle, the idea that everyone counts, is under attack in ways that it has not been in some time. Now at the ACLU, we work on, I counted it up, more than 103 separate issues, but I want to talk with you today about just two of them that I think are especially important. Two ways that the idea that everyone counts is under attack. The first is in the area of voting rights. Voting rights. Now if you had told me 15 years ago that there was any work at all left to be done on voting rights, I would have told you that you were crazy. Because the truth of the matter is that this was something we had more or less resolved as a country. Over time, we had decided that everyone does, in fact, have the right to vote, that all citizens should have easy access to the ballot, and that we would try and encourage citizens to vote. But for the last 15 years, there has been a sustained campaign to make it harder and harder for people to vote. And that flies in the face of our history. Because for most of our history, we have made it easier and easier. We have expanded the franchise rather than limiting it. Think about it. In the year 1789, when the Republic was founded, just 6% of the people who lived in this country were even eligible to vote. Just 6%. Only rich white men. Not just men, not just white men, rich white men. And then over time, we said that in fact everyone should count, and so we expanded the franchise. First to poor white men, and then, after the Civil War, we temporarily expanded the franchise to African Americans. They then lost it through the days of Jim Crow and segregation. Then we extended the franchise to white women with the constitutional amendment at the turn of the 20th century. And then finally, through the civil rights movement of the 1960s, the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we said that every citizen of this country should, in fact, have the right to vote. Such that, 10 years ago, over 75% of the people who live in this country were eligible to vote. The only folks who are not eligible to vote are obviously non-citizens, folks under the age of 18, and in some states, folks who have a criminal record. But we made great progress from just 6% in 1789 to the mid-70s today. But the fact of the matter is that for the last 15 years, there have been folks who are trying to chip away at that eligibility, who've tried to make it harder for people to register to vote, turn out to vote, and have that vote count. That culminated a few years ago when the Supreme Court of the United States struck down a key part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. a law that was literally born of sweat and blood sacrifice by civil rights workers in the South. And the very same day that the Supreme Court ruled in that case, the very same day, literally within hours, 4 hours later, there were states that were introducing new restrictions on the right to vote. And since then, 22 states have adopted new restrictions that make it harder for folks to register, turn out, and have their vote count. And every single one of them has disproportionately impacted African Americans, Latinos, and senior citizens. Every last one. Now in Kansas, we are blazing new trails in this respect because we have the single most restrictive law on voter registration since the days of Jim Crow. You've heard a lot of the news about Wisconsin and Texas and North Carolina, and they are all awful, and I oppose all of those laws. But Kansas is much, much worse. Because in Kansas, we have something called the Documentary Proof of Citizenship law. It makes it sound noble, it makes it sound virtuous. I agree that only citizens have the right to vote and only citizens should vote. But that is not what this law is about. What this law is about is a papers, please requirement. You have to produce either a birth certificate or a passport in order to register to vote. And that too might seem reasonable to you at first until you start thinking about all the folks who don't have easy access to either one of those documents. For example, the woman who we know who was born at home on a farm in the 1920s in a different state, where they did not give birth certificates to folks who were born at home on the farm, only to folks who were born in a hospital or under a doctor's care. She never had a birth certificate at all. She was born, I've seen her, she exists, but she does not have a birth certificate. Or there's the fellow who we represent who was born on an Air Force base in Illinois. It was one of those bases that closed in the 1990s when the federal government started closing bases around the country. No one knows what happened to the medical records that were in the basement of that military hospital. The Department of Defense doesn't know, the Department of Veterans Affairs doesn't know. And so he isn't able to get his birth certificate either. Or you can think about the thousands of students at KU whose birth certificate is at home in their parents' basement in a Tupperware container. They don't have it either. You add all of those groups up, and you're talking about almost 50,000 citizens in Kansas who tried to register to vote but were stopped from doing so by this particular requirement. It is unconscionable, it is wrong, it is illegal. And we know it's illegal because we at the ACLU have filed not one, not two, not three, but 4 separate lawsuits to have the courts stop this law from being implemented. And so far, the courts have ruled in our favor, and not just 1, not just 2, not just 3, but all 4 of those lawsuits. And I might point out to you that the judge who has made those rulings was appointed by noted liberal commie pinko sympathizer George W. Bush. This is not a partisan issue. This is about whether or not we believe that people count. Because at the end of the day, that's what voting rights are really about. It galls me to no end that most of what you see in the news and the media and the public discussion about voting rights is about partisanship. It's about one party or the other. And it all gets dismissed as somehow one party or the other trying to make it harder for the other party. It's dismissed as sort of political hacks being political hacks, doing whatever they do in order to prevail in the end. And that's not what this struggle is about at all. That minimizes, diminishes what is really at stake. Because the right to vote is really about a marker of citizenship. It's not about whether you can go in and pull the lever for some particular candidate. That's part of it. But the bigger issue is whether or not you count. Whether you are part of the community or excluded from it. Whether you are part of society or exiled from it. That's what the right to vote is about. It's about who is part of community and who is not. And to pretend like that is just some silly partisan triviality is a shame. So we will continue to fight for the right to vote at the ACLU in Kansas, where it is worse, and in the other 49 states as well. And we especially have to do that because just a few minutes before I came here today, the president announced a new commission to combat voter fraud, which does not exist, and named as its vice chair the Secretary of State in Kansas, Kubic, who has been the architect of every single voter restriction that has been implemented in any of those 22 states. So we have a lot of work to do. The second issue that I want to talk with you about is criminal justice reform. Because we believe the criminal justice system in this country is badly broken. Too many people are going to prison for too long, for too trivial of reasons, and costing you, the taxpayers, far too much money in the process. In Kansas, for example, the prison population has more than quadrupled over the last 40 years. It went from about 2,500 people in the 1970s to almost 10,000 people today, even though the crime rate in Kansas is the lowest it has ever been. So the crime rate, the nonviolent crime rate, is the lowest it has ever been in the history of them keeping statistics. The violent crime rate in Kansas is the lowest it has ever been in the history of them keeping statistics. And yet the prison population is the highest it has ever been. There is a mismatch there. Those two lines should not be going in those directions together. And of course, we also know that there are enormous racial disparities in the prison population in Kansas. Nationwide, for example, African Americans make up 12% of the population and 35% of the prison population. In Kansas, African Americans make up just 6% of the state's population, but 35% of the prison population. And when you include Latinos, Native Americans, and Asian Americans, the Kansas prison population is nearly 55% made up of people of color, even though the state is just 15% made up of people of color. Now, we can disagree about why that is. We can disagree about the solutions. What we should not disagree about, however, is that that is a problem. There is something fundamentally wrong going on when you have a disproportionality that large. We can disagree about why and how, but what we ought not to disagree about is that it is a problem that needs to be fixed. That's why we at the ACLU have formed a statewide coalition called Kansans for Smart Justice, made up of faith-based groups and civil rights groups and prison ministries and chambers of commerce, in order to say that we need to fix this broken system. We're focused on a couple things, but especially we're focused on changing drug crimes, drug possession, from a felony to a misdemeanor. So still a crime, but rather than a felony, it becomes a misdemeanor. That's because simple, nonviolent drug possession is the #1 thing that sends people to prison in Kansas. Almost 30% of all people who go to prison in Kansas do so for simple, nonviolent drug possession. The next largest contributor is burglary at 10%. Not anything violent, right? That's not what 30% of people going to prison are going there for. Not for violent crimes, not for rape, not for murder, not for assault. They're going there for simple, nonviolent drug possession. And so if we converted that crime from a felony to a misdemeanor, we would send far fewer people to prison, make sure that they get the treatment and services they need in communities instead, and we would save you, the taxpayer, tens of millions of dollars in the process. That's especially important because we know that 35% of the people in Kansas prisons today are there because they have a diagnosed mental illness. Especially those who've committed drug crimes are there because they have a diagnosed mental illness. It's not something they got once they got to prison. No, they had the mental illness ahead of time that contributed to their crime and is the reason they are there. Again, I can't speak for you, I can only speak for me, but I can say quite confidently that I do not think prison is a good treatment program for mental illness. And I don't think it helps that individual, I don't think it helps their family, and I don't think it makes our communities any stronger to approach the problem in the way that we are today. That's why we need to fix that broken system. We've made some progress on that front in Kansas, and I think we'll make some more in the future, because already there are 18 states around this country that have done the very thing that we have suggested, including states like Utah and South Carolina and Wyoming and Alaska, and most recently, Oklahoma. In November, more than 60% of the people in Oklahoma voted at the ballot box to make drug crimes a misdemeanor rather than a felony. And I say if they can do it in Oklahoma, my God, we ought to be able to do it in Kansas. So, those are just two of the issues that I would highlight for you where the idea that everyone counts is under attack. There are many, many, many more, but those are the two that are most important to us right now. And when I think about this work, when I think about what is ahead of us, I am reminded of Barbara Jordan. Some folks may remember Barbara Jordan. The first black woman elected to Congress from the South was a representative from Texas who came to prominence in the 1970s during the Watergate hearings with this wonderful speech that she made that has gone down in history as one of the greatest political speeches ever made. And I want to quote to you from just part of it because I think it is relevant. In that famous speech, she said, "We heard the beginning of the preamble to the Constitution of the United States. We, the people. It is a very eloquent beginning. But when that document was completed on the 17th of September in 1787, I was not included in that we, the people. I felt somehow for many years that George Washington and Alexander Hamilton just left me out by mistake. But through the process of amendment, interpretation, and court decision, I have finally been included in we, the people." I think that's what the battles ahead of us are really about. They're about whether we make a liar out of Barbara Jordan or not. They're about whether we really believe that everyone in this country is included in we, the people, or whether we in fact believe that only some people are included in we, the people. The battles ahead of us on voting rights and criminal justice and immigration and equality in general are about whether or not everyone is included in we, the people, whether we will make the promise of the Constitution a reality for every person in this country. I can guarantee you that we at the ACLU will do everything we can to stand up for the principle that everyone counts and that everyone in this room, in this city, in this state, in this country is included in we, the people. Thank you.
Micah, thank you very much. I'm sure there's going to be at least one or two questions from our group.
Great. It's my favorite part.
Right. I am going to somewhat disagree as a senior citizen. Number one, just to cash a check, I have to show property ID. Number two, I could not fly to a foreign country without a passport. I had to go get my birth certificate in order to get a passport, just to get on an airplane. So I see nothing wrong with the voting rights to prove you're a citizen. Now, as a senior citizen, I had to prove it.
So I'm going to respectfully disagree again, as I expected that you would expect me to, right? So there is obviously first a big difference. So when you go to cash a check, you do not have to take a passport or a birth certificate with you. Some banks do make you provide photo identification. That is not what we're talking about in Kansas. So it's very important for folks to understand that the requirement in Kansas, your driver's license, for example, is not sufficient. Many of the 50,000 people on that list produced a driver's license, and their registrations were promptly canceled and terminated. A driver's license is not sufficient. You have to produce a birth certificate or a passport. Second of all, in the other 49 states of the country, because Kansas is the only state in the entire country that uses this system, in the other 49 states, the way that you prove your citizenship, because every state requires you to do so, is that you sign a legal affidavit affirming that you are in fact a citizen. And if that is not true, you are prosecuted for perjury as well as potentially for voter fraud. And of course, we use legal affidavits in every other aspect of our lives. In fact, the Secretary of State in Kansas uses them when people contest this process. He says that a legal affidavit is sufficient. So I fail to see why an affidavit is not acceptable at the front end of the process as well. And finally, I would point out that the right to vote is separately protected 5 separate times in the Constitution. The right to fly internationally is not so protected, and so it makes a very big difference in that respect.
Thank you. So first, thank you for choosing to walk your walk so authentically by starting with Howard. Thank you for that, and thank you for your choice of career in doing it so purely. My question was tagging on to what the gentleman there pointed out. So maybe I need just a little bit more. I think that we are doing overkill on the voter fraud, and I think it's like running over an ant with a bulldozer because there's not substantial evidence that there's this enormous fraud going on. But I think I need a little more, because I agree that you should be an American citizen to vote in American elections. The legal affidavit part gets muddy for me, and so could you just take a little bit more time on how one gets the legal affidavit to get to
Sure.
the simple path that the ACLU would suggest to get us out of this pickle?
Sure. So in 49 of the 50 states, when you sign your voter registration form, the voter registration form is itself a legal affidavit. It contains a statement at the bottom of it, right above your signature, that says that you affirm under penalty of perjury that what you're signing is that you are a citizen. And of course, we use affidavits like that in every other interaction that we have with the government and in private business as well. And the federal government uses the same legal affidavit on the federal voter registration form, which is required to be accepted by all 50 states, including Kansas. So that's the simple path, is that your voter registration form is actually, people don't understand that, but it actually is a legal affidavit.
What you were trying to say, I'm sorry.
No, it's a common thing that folks don't know that it is a legal affidavit, but it is in fact one.
We have Joan, go ahead, Joan.
I and many others here are from Missouri, and I know you're very knowledgeable about Kansas, but I suspect you know about Missouri's record also. Did you address that at all?
It's not a lot better. It's a little better, though. In Missouri, the voters in November passed a new photo ID requirement at the polls. So Missouri does not have the proof of citizenship requirement that Kansas does. Kansas's requirement is to get registered, and then there are separate issues when you show up at the polls. Missouri's issue is about showing up at the polls, not the registration side. But now in Missouri, you do have to produce a photo ID. This was done through a constitutional amendment that the voters passed because previous attempts to do this legislatively were found unconstitutional by the courts. So they amended the Missouri Constitution to make it legally acceptable. I will say that in some respects, Missouri's photo ID requirement, although I think still bad, is not nearly as bad as some other states because they included a provision within it that if you are not able to produce the photo ID that time, you can sign a legal affidavit that you are a citizen, and that at your first opportunity you will go and avail yourself of some options that they are creating to make free photo IDs available to folks. They haven't done that in every state.
Missouri will accept, or Kansas City at least, will accept the voter registration card.
It's included as sort of a grandfather clause in the constitutional amendment that was accepted, at least temporarily. I expect that to be challenged.
I know there's a lot of questions. We probably only have time for one more for the audience, and then I think, Micah, would you mind staying? If I just want to jump? Okay, so we have time for one more. Go ahead, Sarah.
Hi, thank you for being here today. I just kind of wanted to pick your brain a little bit about trying to get people to move from this slacktivist activism idea into a real activist mode. That's something I'm struggling with as a community organizer. So how do we get people, regardless of what you believe in, to go from sharing a social media post and feeling like you're changing the world to going out and getting canvassing, phone banking, petition, ballot initiatives?
So I think regardless of your political perspective and regardless of what you support and believe in, the key is to understand that it does make a difference. I can't tell you how many groups I speak to where the folks tell me, oh, I don't want to hear about making phone calls to my elected officials. I don't want to hear about writing letters. I want to do something more instead. Well, that is the more that you can do. All of those phone calls, those emails, those notes, they actually do make a difference. The folks in elected office do listen. You're not going to get your elected official to support your point of view every single time. There are some elected officials who may not ever support your particular point of view, but there are always elected officials who are willing to listen, and you move some of them along the way. And I think when folks know that, when they know that speaking up and taking a stand in that way is not just sort of feel-goodism, is not a waste of their time, but actually is effective over the long run, that folks will do it more. That's my hope. But I encounter a lot of people who don't want to believe that for whatever reason, or who simply just think that it doesn't matter, right? Or they want me to come up with some new magical, mystical, imaginary, secret knowledge that no one else knows about how to make a difference. And the real way to make a difference on policy issues is to get in touch with your elected officials, make sure that they know how you feel, and if they disagree with you, that's their right too. and you just keep on showing up, speaking up, and making sure that folks know there is another voice out there. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.